Hello? All right, we're going to go for an hour, 1:30 to 2:30. Then we'll take a 15-minute break. We only have like 3 sessions this afternoon. One thing I want to remind everybody of, if you leave the building going out the front door over here, we just painted the outside of that whole trim. So make sure you don't touch the whole trim unless you want paint all over you. So, all right. Let's give it again. I said, yay! What? Okay. Oh, yeah, and if you'll notice, when it comes time to ask a question, the problem with the people, we have probably close to 1,000 people live streaming, and they don't hear the question. And then they wonder what in the world he's talking about. So we have a microphone stand with a microphone right here by that white pillar. When you have a question, you can stand over there so we can record the question so people can follow. Take it away.
Okay, and if it's possible for folks who are in the stream.
Jill, do you know if anyone streaming can ask a question? Yeah. Yes, they can.
Okay.
Those of you who are those of you who are live streaming, we also will. If you have a question that you would like to ask him, let us know. But he is married, so.
Thank you for making that point clear. Okay, great. Okay, so I do want to, on that note, reiterate that this is a group effort, so if you have anything to say, then please say it. That is, you can't possibly interrupt, because if you have something to say, that's not interruption, that's part of what we're doing in this fellowship. We noted in the last sessions, when we were talking about Amalek, Agag, on the way, that there's more to say on the whole subject of that Amalek Agag connection. So I'm just going to review briefly how we get into that and take it from there. So, of course, as we've already noted, 5 times in the book of Esther, Haman is explicitly identified as an Agagite. We see this when he is first introduced in Esther chapter 3, verse 1, Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. Likewise, when the king gives his ring to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. And on the other end, in Esther chapter 8, when Esther is beseeching the king to cast away the evil that Haman, the Agagite, has done, and 2 verses afterward, in a quotation, that is specifically, that the reversal of the books or letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews. And finally, the very last instance in which Haman appears, he appears likewise as Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews. And inevitably, in trying to understand what the Agagite means, we consider the only 2 passages, again, this is all review, so I'm doing it rather speedily, the only 2 passages in the Bible in which we encounter the name Agag. The more relevant for our purposes, more directly relevant, is in the first book of Samuel, chapter 15, where we read in Saul smiting Amalek, smiting the Amalekites, that he seized Agag, the king of Amalek, alive. And again, in the following verse, Saul and the people had pity on Agag, and the best of the sheep and the cattle. And in our tradition, that night, Agag ensured that his lineage would not be lost by making out with a gal in prison. And even though Samuel kills him the next day, Agag lives on. And the only other instance in which we encounter the name Agag in the final prophecy of Balaam, he's speaking of the one who will come forth from Israel. And speaking of waters shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters, and his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. So again, reference to Agag. As we noted this morning, we can understand this reference to Agag, the self-same name that we encountered in Samuel, either in two ways. Either it is prophetic, which certainly is possible, that as we certainly find prophets referring to people who had not yet been born, or that this is a title. That this may be the way all kings of Amalek were known, in the same way that Pharaoh is king of Egypt, and Abimelech is king of Gerar, and the king of Jerusalem was either Melchizedek or Adonai, as we discussed yesterday. So it could be in either of these senses. Certainly then, the connection of Haman to Agag, we do understand as the Amalekite connection. And just noting in this vein that when we consider the imperative in Deuteronomy chapter 25 to remember what Amalek did unto you by the way as you went forth out of Egypt, how he happened upon you, chanced upon you by the way, and smote the hindmost of you, all that were enfeebled in your rear, when you were faint and weary, and he feared not God. We appreciate that the Hebrew word that is being rendered here as remember, Zachar, is a word that has an additional connotation of actually making mention, saying it. Just as an example, we encounter the same word exactly in the fourth commandment of the Ten Commandments, to remember, or alternatively, make mention of the Sabbath day to make it holy. And in practice, we do that. We make mention. That is, in the sanctification that we say at the beginning of the Sabbath, we actually verbalize making the Sabbath holy. We recite the 3 verses that describe the Sabbath in creation, Genesis chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3. We say a blessing of sanctification. We say it. And likewise with respect to remembering Amalek. We don't just remember in our minds, we say it. How do we say it? We read these passages. That is, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17, 18, and 19. The reading of the remembrance of what Amalek did is something that we do on an annual basis. That is, besides reading these words, when we're reading Deuteronomy chapter 25, which comes out during the summer, we always read these 3 verses, 17, 18, 19, and 19 includes the imperative to erase the memory of Amalek. And when do we have this reading as a means for remembering and making mention? The Shabbat, the Sabbath, immediately before Purim. In other words, it's coming up. But that's exactly how we see this as personified in Haman and in the battle against Haman. And of course, inevitably we appreciate that these verses, and perhaps even more so, the verses that describe the circumstances of the battle itself in Exodus chapter 17 are the framework, the source of what the Bible tells us about Amalek. We should just take a look at this passage in Exodus chapter 17 in order to further amplify this point. This is in Exodus chapter 17, beginning in verse 8. Amalek came and did battle with Israel in Rephidim. And God says to Joshua, choose for us men and go battle with Amalek. Tomorrow, we talked about tomorrow earlier, I stand upon the top of the hill, the mountain, and the staff of the Lord is in my hand. And so Joshua did as Moses had said to him, to wage war with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur ascended to the top of the hill. And of course, there's this miraculous representation of the battle. When Moses lifts up his hands, Israel is victorious. When he lets his hands slacken, then Amalek is victorious, and Moses keeps his hands uplifted until, as we read in verse 13, Joshua enfeebled the Amalek and his people by the sword, was victorious in battle. And then what we read, it's critical. And God said to Moses, write this as a remembrance in the book and put it in the ears of Joshua, that I will surely erase the memory of Amalek from beneath the heavens. And Moses built an altar and called its name, God is my banner, God is my miracle, and said, as it were, God's hand is upon his throne. It's like an oath. Everlasting war between God and Amalek from generation to generation. That's the end of chapter 17 in Exodus. In other words, I was just reading now verses 14, 15, and 16. So that's the battle. And maybe the first point of note that we should stress is, you might say, there's a contradiction here between what we read in Exodus chapter 17 and what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 25, because after all, in chapter 25, the culmination of the verses that we saw in the last verse, verse 19 is, it will come to pass when God, your Lord, gives you rest from all of your enemies round about in the land that God, your Lord, is giving you as an inheritance to possess, you shall erase the memory of Amalek beneath the heavens. You shall not forget. So where's the contradiction? What? Where's there an apparent contradiction? It's not a contradiction, but it looks like a contradiction. No, that's not a problem. But between Exodus and Deuteronomy. In Exodus chapter 17, who's doing the erasing? God. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, who's doing the erasing? Man. So which is it? Is it God or is it man? Of course, the answer is yes. That is, this, of course, is so foundational altogether in God's commands. And, we mentioned before the commandment to remember, make mention of the Sabbath day to make it holy. And isn't that just another illustration of precisely the same theme? That is, in Genesis chapter 2, God makes the Sabbath holy. We read explicitly in chapter 2, verse 3, God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. So what's he telling us to do in the Ten Commandments to remember or make mention of the Sabbath day to make it holy? Most of the translations get it wrong as a result. They say to keep it holy, to remember it. That's not what the text says. The text says in Hebrew, lekadesho, which means to sanctify it, to make it holy. And it's not a contradiction because that's exactly the theme. Constantly, the greatest gift that God gives us is the opportunity to become his junior partners. God could do it all by himself. And he invites us to be participants, active participants. As we discussed yesterday, one of the most crucial messages in the Bible is that history is something that marches forward. It's not going around in circles. There's a destination. There's a goal. And that, as we noted, is one of the most critical messages that we see in the Bible in general, and perhaps in particular in Moses' song in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Because, in Deuteronomy chapter 32, there isn't too much that we learn were it not for that. Because we already know about sin, punishment, and so on. The message, the critical new message that we glean from Deuteronomy chapter 32 is precisely this. There's a game plan. This is a drama unfolding. God is the master playwright. God's the master playwright, but as we discussed yesterday, he's also casting director. And he tells each of us to take our role in this drama. And you can choose to be on God's side, and you can choose to be against God, but you can't choose to sit it out. You cannot choose to be irrelevant because you are relevant. God created you. He put you in this world. You are supremely relevant. You are going to be an important player. And one way or another, you are going to advance God's plan to its utmost conclusion. So, again, getting back to that first encounter with Amalek, the consequence is Amalek has been identified as this utmost enemy, such that, again, in Exodus chapter 17, God guarantees the erasure of Amalek, and Deuteronomy chapter 25, he tells us we need to do it ourselves. But it's important for me to stress, I can't stress this point enough. Is this about ethnicity? Absolutely not. And I'll emphasize that point on two planes. First plane is that when we read the culmination of this process of the destruction of Amalek in the broader context of Obadiah. Obadiah is talking about Esau, Edom. Well, we already noted, and we'll get back to this point shortly, we already noted that Amalek is Esau's grandson. But it's important for us to stress that with respect to the fate of Esau, the fate of Edom, it is likewise not a matter of ethnicity, it's a matter of the choices that Esau makes and the choices that his descendants make. And as a result, it's not about a complete erasure of Esau, but rather, in our tradition, when we read the utmost assessment that when the house of Jacob is described as fire, and the house of Joseph as flame, and the house of Esau as stubble, that they will burn it up and consume it, there will be no remnant to the house of Esau, not in the sense of the extirpation of the nation, but rather in the sense that those who still cleave to the way of Esau are destroyed. But in the very end, the last words of the prophecy of Obadiah, that the saviors go up in Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom is the Lord's. The kingdom is the Lord's because ultimately Esau is also going to come on board. That is, the implication here definitely is that it's not a matter of the destruction, but ultimately what is left of Esau will likewise be dedicated to the Lord. And this really is a recurrent theme that we see in the Bible. It's not a matter of a particular ethnicity, it's a matter of dedication to God's word. And I'll just note in this vein as well that we have a tradition on this score. there's the Noahide Covenant, the laws that are considered binding on all of humanity, all descendants of Noah. I'll note parenthetically, maybe more than parenthetically, that when there is the deliberation in Acts chapter 15 over what is going to be demanded of the Gentiles. So James gives an answer. What James says is going to be demanded of the Gentiles is, in fact, a partial list of the Noahide laws that comprise 6 prohibitions. There is a prohibition on murder, a prohibition on stealing, a prohibition on paganism, which means deifying what is not God, a prohibition on blasphemy, cursing God in God's name, a prohibition on eating a limb torn from a living animal, and a prohibition on forbidden sexual relationships. And then a positive injunction to enforce these 6 prohibitions. And we see not only in James' words, we see also in the letters of Paul that these commandments are going to be binding on all of humanity. And if I may add here, one of the great scholars of the 18th century, Rabbi Jacob Emden, in the year 1757, published an essay on the subject of Christianity and Christian scripture. I must admit, I never saw the likes of it anywhere before or since in rabbinical literature. He quotes copiously from Christian scripture in order to bolster his argument. The argument basically is that Jesus and the apostles, he emphasizes the point particularly with Paul, but generalizes it to them all, had a dual agenda: to reinforce among the Jews the observance of the Torah and all the commandments of the Torah, and to establish for the Gentile world a new religion that really wasn't essentially new, in order to institutionalize keeping the Noahide commandments for the entire world. So that's what James is saying, that we demand of the Gentiles keeping the Noahide covenant. As for the Torah, the Jews are reading the Torah every Sabbath in the synagogue. So again, very much this message of the Noahide covenant. The reason I'm mentioning it in the context of Amalek is, so what happens if an Amalekite dedicates himself to keeping the Noahide covenant? Do we let him or do we kill him? And the answer unequivocally is, not only do we let him, we encourage him. Because the moment that he dedicates himself to keeping the Noahide covenant, then, to use the formulation in our tradition, he's not Amalek anymore. He is one of the accepted, welcomed members of the nations who has a legitimate place in God's plan. So it's not at all about ethnicity. It's about, like everything else, of choosing. Which side are you on? Are you on God's side? Are you not on God's side? So the first point of emphasis, when you talk about Amalek, is Amalek definitely represents something. But it's not a matter of ethnic Amalek represents something. It's a matter of Amalek represents something which applies to ethnic Amalek if they so choose. But here's the rub. If you ask me, so who is ethnic Amalek today? We don't have a clue. However, if someone chooses to be a modern day incarnation of Amalek, then ethnicity doesn't make a bit of difference in this direction either. It's not a matter of ethnic identity Amalek. Such a person has made himself into Amalek. There's an ideology of Amalek. an ideology of wanton cruelty, an ideology of unprovoked attack, an ideology that God has his plan and we will do everything we can to thwart it. That ideology, even if Amalek as a national group is completely lost and erased and disappeared, unfortunately is still alive and kicking. We saw that ideology in the Holocaust. We saw that ideology on the last day of Tabernacles this year. Right? So Amalek is still an issue. And that's one dimension that we need to bear in mind, of course, in the story of Purim. Because at the end of the day, if you ask me, so how important is it for Haman to actually be genealogically descended from Agag and from Amalek? Not at all. Because the moment Haman has set himself up as the enemy of Israel and ultimately, more than that, the enemy of God, then Haman has become Amalek, even if his ethnic identity might have been something entirely different. In this regard, maybe the most important words to bear in mind are the words that we read in Psalm 83. And I'm sure you know all these words, but I'm just still going to say it by way of review. This is a song, a psalm of Asaph. God, don't be silent. Don't be still. Don't be quiet, O Lord. For your enemies are murmuring, and those who hate you have lifted up their head. And how does that express itself? Over your people, they take crafty deliberations and seek counsel over those whom you have vouchsafed. They said, let us go and obliterate them from being a nation, that the name Israel will be no more in remembrance. That's the way they do battle with God. That's Amalek. And my invocation of Amalek here is not by any means some kind of abstraction, because just a few verses afterward, we read who's involved in this, and in verse 7, these are the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab, the Hagrim, Gival, Ammon, and Amalek, and the Philistines and those who dwell in Tyre. Boy, you wonder if the psalm came out of the newspapers. Maybe it's the other way around. Anyway, but we well appreciate this is definitely an ongoing battle, and that's one of the dimensions that we need to bear in mind in considering the Purim story, who Amalek is. But simultaneously, there's an additional dimension that we also need to bear in mind, and we referred to it briefly earlier today, but now it's really important for us to focus upon it at much greater length, and that is, we noted from whom Amalek descends. That is, when we read in Genesis chapter 36 of all of the family history of Esau, so we read explicitly that one of the princes of Esau in Genesis chapter 36, in verse 16, is the prince of Amalek. And as for how he gets into the family tree, so specifically, we read in verse 12 that Timna was the concubine of Eliphaz, Eliphaz being the firstborn son of Esau, and Timna bore to Eliphaz, Amalek. Okay, so again, we know who Eliphaz was. Eliphaz is the firstborn of Esau. Who was Timna? This is a fascinating question that has a tantalizing answer. Because after we read of the family tree of Esau, we read of the family tree of Seir, the indigenous inhabitants whom Esau displaced, combined with, assimilated into in Edom, because they're one and the same. And in the recounting of the family tree of Seir, we read that one of the princes of Seir is Lotan, and in verse 22, the children of Lotan, the Horite, and were the Horite and Haman, and the sister of Lotan was Timna. The same Timna, who becomes a concubine of Eliphaz, which seems kind of strange. Because, generally speaking, without going into the structure of the society and family in the ancient world, generally speaking, concubines were not from the higher echelons of society. And Timna is a princess. So how does she end up becoming the concubine of Eliphaz? The Bible doesn't say. But it clearly is emphasizing the point because, hey, otherwise, who cares who Timna was? And you see the Bible makes a point of telling you that Timna was the sister of Lotan. She was royalty in the Seir, and simultaneously she is the concubine of Eliphaz, who bears to Eliphaz Amalek. So, in our tradition, we haven't answered this question. Again, it's not explicit in the Bible. It is Midrash. That Timna had a sense of the God-bondedness of Abraham and his household. And she came to Abraham's household, and Abraham refused to accept her. And she came to Isaac's household, and Isaac refused to accept her. She came to Jacob's household. Jacob wouldn't accept her. And she was so perseverant in wanting to become part of this household, she offers herself as a concubine to Eliphaz, son of Esau. And this story, as you can well imagine, that is enunciated in the Midrash, is intended as an indictment. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they didn't accept her. She ended up concubine of Eliphaz, bearing Amalek, who causes so much pain and misery and anguish to the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, on the one hand, we could conjecture that someone who ends up mother of Amalek was maybe not exactly the greatest person in the world. And that could be, but it's still an indictment. Don't send someone away if she says she wants to come closer. And that sending away was something that had historic consequences. And on some level, that means that when there is a dark side of humanity, it's not enough for us to put the finger on the dark side of humanity. We also have to look for a dark side in ourselves. Because if that dark side exists, we are all bonded together, there's some element of personal responsibility here. In our tradition, man is created singly, just Adam and Eve. And there are a number of lessons that we learn from the fact there wasn't a collection. It wasn't a collective, it was specifically Adam and Eve. One of the lessons is, no one can ever say to anyone else, my ancestors are greater than your ancestors, because we all have the same ancestor. Another message is, man is created singly because each and every single solitary individual is obligated to say, for me, the world was created. And capture that thought. It's an obligation to say, for me, the world was created. You might think, hey, it's a privilege to say the world was created for me. It's prerogative. Why is it a responsibility? It's a responsibility because that means you're responsible for the whole world. If you read an article about they were burning down the rainforests in the Amazon, and you might be inclined to say, okay, so what? It's not my rainforest. Oh, yes, it is. You're responsible. You're responsible for everything. The most important principle that the Bible establishes is human responsibility, because everything derives from that realization that God has given us responsibility. He's not coddling us like a bunch of babies. He gives us responsibility to be responsible adults. So when we see that there is darkness in the world, when we see that there is Amalek outside, we need to recognize that there's something inside that on some plane resonates with that darkness on the outside. There's a battle that still needs to be waged and won in our own souls. Not just the external one, also the internal battle. And that brings me, besides Amalek the nation, besides Amalek the man, and his parents and his story, to an additional level that brings us back really much further, deeply into the past. And I'll note this if we consider again those words of Balaam in Numbers chapter 24, where he, indeed, besides making mention of Agag, explicitly refers to Amalek. In Numbers chapter 24, verse 20, he saw Amalek, and he took up his parable and said, the first of nations is Amalek, but in its end, it will be utterly destroyed. First of nations, the most straightforward, simple meaning of the expression is the first of nations to do battle with Israel, the unprovoked attack. Israel is just coming out of Egypt. They aren't starting up with Amalek, and Amalek comes to do battle with Israel. Again, what we read in Exodus chapter 17. But there's a deeper level of meaning too. Haman's name is spelt in Hebrew, Hey, Mem, Nun. For the Hebrew experts, that should be fairly straightforward. There's a word with precisely that spelling that appears way earlier on in the Bible. And we have a homiletic connection between that word and what ends up being the legacy of Haman. That word with different vowels. Remember that in Hebrew, the letters are the consonants. That word is the opening word of God's indictment of Adam after Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowing good and evil. After they eat of the tree, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8 and on, we read, they heard the sound, voice of God the Lord going through the garden, the wind of the day, and Adam and his wife hid from God the Lord among the trees of the garden. God the Lord called to Adam and said to him, "Where are you?" And of course, "Where are you?" is not because God doesn't know where Adam is. It's actually not so much a question. Remember, here it's expressed as a call. Look what you did to yourself. Where are you now? What have you become of who you were? But Adam doesn't get it. So he says, I heard your voice in the garden, and I feared because I was naked, and I hid. God said, who told you that you were naked? Hamin ha'etz. Did you indeed of the tree regarding which I commanded you not to eat of it, you ate? So, did you indeed of the tree? Hamin, same letters of Haman. And Adam still doesn't get it. So he passes the buck and he says, the woman whom you gave me of the tree, and I did eat. And when God accuses Eve, then her response likewise is to pass the buck. The snake seduced me and I did eat. And of course, God's response then ensues with respect to the snake, with respect to Eve, and with respect to Adam. What relevance could this possibly have to the story of Haman, to the story of Amalek? All the relevance in the world. Because, again, apropos of what we already saw, in realizing that it wasn't a matter of ethnicity, in realizing that when we see darkness outside, you have to be wary first and foremost of the darkness within. The whole story of Amalek on some plane is a profound throwback to the circumstances through which, because of which, evil is in the world altogether. Now, I'm going to reiterate again something that I said yesterday because it's critically important in this discussion, and that is, who created evil? God. Because who created everything? God. So when we read in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, that God says, He is the one who formed light and creates darkness, makes peace and creates evil. I, the Lord, have done all these things. So God is telling you He's the one. And likewise, as we noted in Amos chapter 3, verse 6, shall evil befall the city if God has not commanded it? And likewise, in Lamentations chapter 3, verse 38, do not from the mouth of the Most High proceed both the evil and the good. Everything comes from God. And yet simultaneously, we discussed this yesterday. How do we understand this creation of evil? How do we understand creating darkness? Since darkness, as we noted, is an absence, not a presence. So what does create mean? Creating the potentiality for the withdrawal. In the case of creating darkness, creating the potential for the light being withdrawn. God forms light, He creates the potential for light being withdrawn. That's creating darkness. God makes peace, shalom. Shalom doesn't just mean peace. Shalom comes from the root of shalem, complete. So God makes completeness. But it's not an inexorable completeness because there's the potential for that completeness to be broken. There's the potential for deficiency. And all evil is deficiency. So God creates the potential for evil. And how do we see that manifest? At the beginning of Genesis, God creates the potential for evil. What did God create? The tree. The tree of knowing good and evil. The potential. Who actualized that potential? Mankind. Adam and Eve. Eating of the tree. Taking that potential and making it actual. And on the one hand, Haman, did you indeed of the tree regarding which I commanded you not to eat of it, you ate, is the indictment in the wake of the sin. And simultaneously, that definitely is part and parcel of the significance of Hamin, same letters as Haman. And at the same time, I think it's critical for us to conceive of what God says to Adam also on an additional, on a deeper plane. Man already made the choice, committed the sin. That divine indictment, did you indeed eat of the tree regarding which I commanded you not to eat of it, is in a sense the first step in a long, arduous process of redeeming man. The sin was already done. The worst state of affairs is the sin was done and mankind is not owning up to the sin. Not taking responsibility. That's the worst. That's even worse than sinning. Sinning can be followed by repentance, by the long journey back home. As we noted, teshuvah, the last verse of Samuel 1, chapter 7. The description of the prophet Samuel as a circuit court judge. We talked about this yesterday. The last verse, his teshuvah was to Ramah because that's where his home was. Teshuvah, returning home. We sin, God always leaves the door open for us to come back home. We just have to decide we want to come home. But you can't come home if you don't realize you're not home. You can't come home if you don't take responsibility. So worse than the sin is the failure to take responsibility. And when God says, did you indeed eat of the tree regarding which I commanded you not to eat? Hello? Are you going to take responsibility? Now, this is just the first step because, of course, Adam's answer to the question, are you going to take responsibility, is, no, I'm passing the buck, it's her fault. But it's still a first step. Because eventually, one way or another, he's going to have to own up to that responsibility. So, this word, on the one hand, signifies the downfall of man in sinning. But at the same time, it also, other side of the same coin is God's ongoing, relentless summons. You can do this. Just get to work. Take responsibility. Start putting things back together again. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be an ongoing, arduous process. But it can only begin once you can answer that question, is that what you did? Yes, that's what I did. Yes. I need to start going back home. So on the one hand then, drawing this connection between Haman and not just Amalek the nation, and not just Amalek the man, and the failing of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's what the Midrash adds here, this additional dimension. They should have been more welcoming to Timna, and we have to seek the root of the darkness, not just outside, but also in our own souls. But on a deeper plane, Haman is an echo of, a throwback to that divine call. Are you going to take responsibility? So you might be asking, so is Haman the representation of the sin or the representation of the divine indictment? And of course the answer necessarily is, drum roll, yes. Yes. Because, when you see Haman as the incarnation of evil incarnate that he made himself into. So of course, on the one hand, we recognize in that, we identify in Haman the inevitable culmination of a process that begins with the sin of Adam and Eve. But at the same time, you see this incarnation of evil, and ironically, maybe it makes it easier for us to say, that is evil. And it comes from here, on some level. When I see it outside, it imposes upon me a challenge, and maybe simultaneously makes it potentially easier for me to recognize I got work to do. So in some sense then, it is precisely because there is this indictment that comes from God. Did you eat of the tree? Are you derailed right now? That indictment imposes upon us the call, the summons. I have to do something about evil in the world. And part of that is, make no mistake about it, there is evil in the world. We need to fight evil in the world relentlessly. That is an ongoing challenge, an ongoing imperative. And at the same time, part of that unswerving dedication to combat evil in the world is to recognize the evil in our own selves, because we have to address that as well. That is, on the one hand, if we close our eyes to the evil in the world outside, then the worst part of that is we've closed our eyes, stopped up our ears to the people who are its direct victims. And when you don't oppose evil, you are an accomplice of evil. All that is necessary for evil to triumph. Edmund Burke, the chronicler of the French Revolution, expressed it, is for good men to do nothing. So we need to stand up against the evil outside. But there's a flip side to that, and that is if we only focus upon the need to redress the evil on the outside, and we don't do anything about the evil on the inside, we're not finished. In a way, we haven't even begun. We have to get our own house in order as well. Now, this is not an either-or proposition. This isn't first do one, then do the other. This is in tandem. We need to be doing battle with the evil on the outside, and we need to be doing battle with the evil on the inside, and we need to make sure that neither of these battles distracts us from the other. Yes?
Is that where the concept of the watchman came into? Watchman that sounds the alarm for when trouble comes?
I mean, certainly, the watchman should be sounding the alarm because there's evil on the outside, and we also need to recognize that we need to hear the call of the watchman because we have people that we have to redress ourselves. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, sometimes we need an alarm. Again, Adam and Eve needed the alarm. For God to say, hello, did you eat of the tree that I told you not to eat of? Because until that moment, they thought they could just hide. Can you imagine? Listen, we can chuckle, but how often do we do the same thing? We think we could just hide. Oh, sorry, you're right. Forgot about the microphone, yeah. Yes, please.
Earlier you said that that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob rejected
Timna.
Yes. Why was that?
So again, I can certainly imagine that a gal who ends up the mother of Amalek was not exactly the greatest character to bring into the household that was going to be preaching the redemption of the world. That could be. Undoubtedly, it wasn't just a matter of gratuitously saying goodbye. And still, in our tradition, it's an indictment. Still in all, that there should have been a striving to figure out some way to bring her into the tent. And that there's a certain element of indictment. This is not something that's stated in the Bible. Actually, this is something that's stated in the Talmud. And we don't usually gratuitously criticize our holy fathers and mothers. But still, obviously, again, this is a message that we need to internalize for ourselves. Always try to figure out how you can bring people into the tent.
Because I think of Jesus and Mary. Or, the prostitute. Mary Magdalene. I'm sorry. Jesus accepted Mary Magdalene.
Okay.
Who was a
Okay.
prostitute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, everyone. Obviously, this is part of my faith tradition, but I'll make it a general statement that everyone is always able to return to God. Again, teshuvah, returning home. God is always there. And God is always ready for us to return to Him.
I had an internet question,
Okay.
and they want to know which translation of the Tanakh in English do you prefer? That's the most accurate.
You see my Bible, right?
Is that Art Scroll? I can't see from here. Is that JPS?
This is the IDF Bible, absolutely exclusively in its original in Hebrew, and as I always like to point out, we got a lot of Bibles at home, as you can well imagine. But this is the one I always take with me because this one is special, because this is the one that I received when I was sworn in as a soldier in the IDF many, many, many years ago, when every soldier receives two things, his Bible and his rifle. His rifle because, unfortunately, for the time being, the Bible isn't enough. Even though there are some places in this country in which I say, you can imagine where, I say, I'm packing, and I take out the Bible.
Yeah. Does that have English in it, though?
No English.
No
English, sorry.
Yeah,
and his Bible, because without the Bible, the rifle is meaningless.
So do you have an English translation company?
When I need to, I check different translations, but what I was just doing right now, of course, was just reading the Hebrew and sight translating into English.
Right, but for those that don't know Hebrew.
I would definitely recommend learning Hebrew.
You want to stay with the Hebrew translation. Okay.
Yeah, I always recall when I was a student in university, like 4.5 decades ago, I had a good friend who was a serious Christian believer, and at one point he said to me, he's decided he's going to learn Hebrew. But he said, don't be offended. The only reason I want to learn Hebrew is in order to be able to read Isaiah and the Psalms in the original. I said, offended? I can't imagine reading them in anything else. So, yeah, definitely, good idea.
All right.
Okay. Okay, so...
He didn't. He
Sorry?
says learn Hebrew. I may have a good announcement for you here in another week or so. Gil, I'll bring the mic to you.
Okay.
Would John the Baptist be the one that would kind of open the door for those of us that need to realize the first thing he did, he wanted to show the people the right way to go? You repent, you bury yourself in the watery grave, come up a new person and walk in a different direction.
So like, I
He
can't...
doesn't know who John the Baptist
Yeah,
is.
I can't. Again, that question itself, of course, you should be directing to Pastor Mark because I don't answer questions about Christian scripture. But certainly the message of returning to God is one that permeates the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and if he was expressing that, then that's very important because that's the most important message that we all need to know, to return to God.
Very short, please. Okay, very short. Fighting the darkness within ourselves as we recognize the evil and the darkness all around, especially now, could be part of learning to accept instruction in the Torah. And,
God bless you. Absolutely. Absolutely.
and then we might have a light coming forward to address the real problems all around us.
I hope everyone heard what you said because I definitely felt your words were inspiring.
Yeah.
And, I think I could summarize maybe in one really critical word what you just said, which when God says what he does to Adam, Adam didn't have, and that was humility.
Exactly. I can't help but think of Proverbs 6:23, that the Torah is the light. That's what it
Right.
says. The
Yeah.
commandment is a lamp. The Torah is light.
Yeah.
And if we want to walk in the light, we got to walk in the light
Yeah.
of the Torah.
God bless you.
All right, let's
God
take a
bless you.
break for 15 minutes.
Okay, we're not finished yet.
We still got
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We got 2 more meetings.
Okay.
All right, everyone, let's get settled down again. We have one more session here.
We have two.
We have two more, but one more right now. I'm just talking about one more session, and then we're going to have one more. So this is the second to the last, the Acharon.
Oh.
All right, are you ready? Drum roll. Kai my son, yay!
Okay. Thank you. Wait. So there was a question that we asked. Yeah, take the microphone. We were going to start with a question because this question was asked during the break, and I said it was much too important for me to answer it privately. So, please.
Adam was unique in that he saw the earth before and after sin entered into it. I was wondering, is there a tradition that addresses whether Adam eventually repented?
The question is excellent. And the truth is, we don't have any explicit attestation in the Bible itself, but yes, there is a tradition. The tradition is, sorry? Wait. That's not explicit. That's a tradition. Okay. So the tradition to which I think Pastor Mark is referring pertains to the Psalm of the Sabbath day. The Psalm of the Sabbath day, Psalm 92, conspicuous, isn't it? How much of that psalm is about the Sabbath day? The answer, well, it depends on what you mean by the Sabbath day. If you mean the seventh day of the week, then the answer is very simple. Nothing. Not a word. But if you understand the Sabbath day in a more expansive sense, the final, ultimate cosmic Sabbath, when everything is restored home, then really the whole psalm is indeed about the Sabbath day in that sense of the term. But the way the psalm begins, after the opening, a psalm of the Sabbath day, Tov lehodot Lashem ulzamer l'shimecha elyon. It is good to give thanks to the Lord, to sing praises to your lofty name. To give thanks. In Hebrew, lehodot. Now you know that every word in biblical Hebrew comes from a three-letter root. And the three-letter root of giving thanks is the same three-letter root of the verb that means to confess one's sins. Now again, in context here, the conjugation indicates it is to give thanks. But we have a tradition. There are different views with respect to just when Adam and Eve left paradise. Was it before the Sabbath? Was it after the Sabbath ended? But with the implication that the text certainly seems to indicate that it was immediately after the sin, which by our tradition took place on the day that they were created. They are sent out just as the Sabbath is about to enter the world. And they leave the Garden of Eden and sit on the Temple Mount because the Temple Mount is adjacent to the gate of the garden. And there they sang this psalm, which we attribute to Adam. It is good to give thanks to the Lord, lehodot, with another conjugation of the same root. It is good, lehitvadot, to confess one's sins. And that this marks the first step. It's a long, arduous process. Arguably, we're still part of that process. But it's the first step of repentance, of returning to God. So, part and parcel of entering into the first Sabbath of the world was confessing one sins before God. And I can't help but note here that there is an enshrined tradition that we have. You know, Friday evening, every Friday evening, we read Genesis chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3. The verses that describe the first Sabbath of creation. And we read them specifically for those who are able to do so. Of course, this isn't an imperative for someone who is physically handicapped, but we read them standing up. Why standing up? Because in a court of law as ordained in the Torah, the witnesses bear testimony standing. And when we read these 3 verses, we are bearing testimony. We are bearing testimony that God created the heavens and the earth. And what does that have to do with confession? Well, because, if I am a sinner, I can't be a valid witness. To be a valid witness, I have to be upright before God. So, before we recite these verses, there's a well-enshrined tradition that we should have in our minds, that we're repenting of all the wrongdoings that we committed over the course of the previous week, returning wholeheartedly to God, so that I will be worthy of serving as a witness in testifying that God created the heavens and the earth. I'll just add, as a kind of postscript on that also, that when we have the privilege of welcoming our Christian brothers and sisters to our Shabbat dinner table, when it's time for me to say the sanctification, sing the sanctification of the Sabbath, we begin that as well with Genesis chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3, and it always gives me a kick to say we're going to stand now because we're going to bear testimony together that God created the heavens and the earth, and we do that standing up, and we're also tacitly fulfilling, at least the first glimmer of fulfillment of Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9. Then I will change to a clear language for all peoples, to call all of them in the name of the Lord, to serve him with one shoulder. That's Pastor Mark's translation. You can translate it as shoulder to shoulder, but really literally with one shoulder. And here we are standing around the table, and we're all standing shoulder to shoulder, bearing testimony that God created the heavens and the earth. So Adam and Eve are also part of that. From the get-go, it is good to give thanks. It is good to confess, returning to God. Again, while I concede that's on the level of tradition, which is exactly the way you asked the question, which I appreciate. It's not explicit in the Bible, but it is deeply ingrained in our tradition that this process of returning home to God is something that could not have been postponed. It had to be from the get-go. It is an ongoing process as we continue to engage in that ongoing process, that ongoing struggle to return home to God. Just a brief parenthetical notation. I don't think we mentioned this yesterday when we talked about the Temple Mount, but if I share with you this tradition about gates of the Garden of Eden being adjacent to the Temple Mount, so you might be wondering, so where's the garden? That is, we can see the Temple Mount. I don't see any garden around there. And my proposition, apropos of what we did discuss yesterday, for those who were here yesterday, talked about how the foundation stone is this phased transition point where in the realm of God everything is completely spiritual and transcendent. In our realm, we encounter physicality, that there is that point where physicality begins, and that is the foundation stone. As I expressed it yesterday, on the other side of the foundation stone, there's no physicality, it's completely spirit. where by other side, I don't mean north side, south side, east side, or west side, I mean inside. But that also means, why is it relevant with respect to where Adam and Eve were sitting when they came out of the garden? That also means that the foundation stone is like a spiritual elevator, a portal. At the foundation stone, you go up to higher floors. Literally out of this world into a higher realm. The Garden of Eden is not on planet Earth as far as we can see. And we've surveyed the planet pretty well. So if there was really a garden like that, we probably would have found it. But the Garden of Eden is a physical garden on a different level of existence. In order to get into our world, you have to take the elevator. And when you come out of the portal from that higher level of existence, you're in this world at the Temple Mount. This is my own personal pet proposition. You can take it or leave it. It's not enshrined in any tradition anywhere. And yes, it was partly inspired by Star Trek, but that's the way my mind works. So as I say, you can take it or leave it. But I figured I'd just throw that in there. Okay? Okay. But actually this question is really directly connected to something that I feel compelled to expand upon, because if indeed we follow this progression to the hilt, again, the realization that there's something in Haman's name that resonates with that first sin and that divine indictment. So it might be a good idea for us to delve into the anatomy of crime and punishment a little bit further in Genesis chapter 3. And while we could spend a great deal of time talking about the anatomy of the sin itself, I realize we don't really have time for that, and I'd like to focus upon the consequences. We already saw the consequence in terms of God's indictment. God indicts Adam. He says, it's her fault. God indicts Eve. She says, it's the snake's fault. And then comes the divine verdict. So, how many guilty parties are there according to the biblical text? 3. Let's name them. Adam, Eve, snake. How many of these parties gets cursed? Just the snake. Look at the Bible. Just the snake. And you know, before we even continue with Adam and Eve, let's try to parse out what this curse is. In verse 14, we're in Genesis chapter 3 still. God the Lord said to the snake, because you did this, you are accursed from all of the beasts, all of the animals of the field. You will go on your belly and eat dust all the days of your life. And I have a pretty glaring, obvious question. It's not my own question, but it's one you can't help but ask when you look at the text. I don't know about your homes, but in my home, if you go on your belly, you'll find dust. You'll find dust galore. What's the curse? If you would condemn the snake to have mile-high legs, and the snake has to eat dust, oh, that's a curse. How are you going to get to the dust? With mile-high legs. If you go on your belly, you'll never run out of dust. Now, of course, it's important for us to appreciate. This is not some template for biological snakes throughout the world. This is the snake in the Garden of Eden. But it's a template that teaches us something really critical about a connection with God and about what cursed means. So where's the curse? So inevitably, in order to be able to answer that question, we need to define the opposite of the curse. What is ultimately the good? To answer that question, we turn to Psalm 73, verse 28. This is the last verse of Psalm 73. Asaph gives us a spot-on definition of what is the good. As for me, nearness of the Lord for me is the good, says Asaph. Closeness to God is the good. Okay, now let's continue this progression one step further. We consider a verse in Psalm 104 that I freely concede I don't really have a handle on understanding. I'm sure none of us do. But we read in Psalm 104, in verse 21, that the young lions roar for prey and ask of God their food. So again, I don't comprehend this because I'm not a young lion, and personally, I don't even know any young lions personally. But what the psalmist is telling us is that when the lions roar for prey, it's a connection between them and God. They're asking God for their food. It's not just human beings who have a connection with God. Every single being, human and animal, has a connection with God. A connection with God because we have needs. And there's only one source that provides for those needs. Our needs come from God. And that provides a connectedness for each and every one of us. When us includes not just humans, also animals. So, God provides each of his creatures, human and animal, with the basis of a connection to him based upon our needs, except for one, the snake in the Garden of Eden. I have decreed upon you existence. You'll have everything you could possibly need, except the one thing that matters, a connection with me. Take your sustenance and get out of here. That's the curse. You'll go on your belly, you'll eat dust, you'll have dust galore, get out of here. No connection with me. And, of course, the inevitable, crucial corollary of that is it's only the snake. It's not Adam and it's not Eve. What does happen to Adam and Eve? Well, although this is going to be a longer discussion than we can manage in the time that we have available, what the sin of eating of the tree of knowing good and evil was, essentially was, they chose to become creative beings. In the Garden of Eden, they were perceptive beings, not creative beings. God says, you chose to become a creative being, you are going to have to bear the consequences of being creative. Creativity hurts. So what's the most creative act that any human being can possibly engage in? Childbirth. Childbirth is going to be excruciatingly painful. With anguish you will bear forth children. That's for half of humanity. What about the other half? What's the most creative act the other half can do? To coax sustenance from a recalcitrant earth to feed those babies. And that's going to hurt too. That is, you're going to be bringing forth briars and thistles and eating of the grass of the earth, and only by the sweat of your nose will you be able to eat bread. It's going to hurt. You chose to be creative, tough love. You will have to bear the consequences of those choices. Is there a question?
Yeah, we have a YouTube question.
Okay, great.
It says, but why would God have put a protective guard keeping Adam and Eve from the garden if they couldn't re-enter? Said with respect.
We haven't gotten there yet. We're going to get, that's way, way down the road in verse 24, but we will get there. Okay. We are aiming to get to verse 24. Question?
Yeah, I was just curious about the snake. If he was already in the garden and called the snake, would he have not already been cursed?
Sorry?
would the snake have not already been cursed? Being the snake,
Why?
being the tempter.
But there's nothing that intrinsically makes the snake into the tempter. That is, the snake is only cursed by consequence of what the snake did.
Is he not in a fallen state already?
There's no such thing as a fallen state. We all have a connection with God.
Yeah, I get that, but
That's it.
so no. Okay.
Okay. We don't have any concept of that. And for the record, it's interesting to note that I always emphasize when we talk about Genesis chapter 33 that we should read the text rather than the midrash, because the text doesn't talk about Satan, the midrash does. But we're looking at the text. The text is talking about the snake, and the snake potentially could have been, should have been subordinated to man's making the right choice. That is, the temptation is always a summons to rise above the challenge and transcend it. Man messed up. Didn't have to be like that. But that we'll put on the side for now. But I want to focus upon, again, what happens in God's verdict with respect to Adam and Eve. That is, again, it isn't that they are accursed, but that they are going to have to deal with the consequences of their choice. And having become creative beings, number one, creativity hurts. Number two, they're not going to be able to stay in the garden anymore. Now, I want to note the order of the progression here. After God tells Eve and then Adam about the consequences of what they have done in terms of the pain and anguish of creativity, the next verse, verse 20, is when Adam calls the name of his wife Eve because she is the mother of all the living. And then, verse 21. Verse 21 is crucial. God the Lord made Adam and his wife cloaks of skin and dressed them. And why is this so important? Nothing about killing. No implication at all in the text that these are leather or anything of the sort. Cloaks of skin could be their own skin. But what's critical here is God is clothing the naked. So, in our tradition, when you consider the 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of Moses begin with an act of kindness and end with an act of kindness. The act of kindness at the beginning is this verse that we just read, verse 21. God clothes the naked. The act of kindness at the end of the 5 books of Moses, at the end of the Torah, in Deuteronomy chapter 34, when Moses dies, in verse 6 we read, he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab. Even though the antecedent of the he isn't stated, presumptively, God is burying Moses. So we know clothing the naked is an act of kindness. Burying the dead is an act of kindness. But of course, there's a deeper message here. It's not just clothing the naked. It's clothing the naked after Adam and Eve have sinned. With respect to Moses, Moses is dying when and where he is dying because of Moses' sin. Sin does not break the bond between us and God. God continues to shower us with his unbridled kindness. So he clothes Adam and Eve after the sin. He buries Moses after his sin. The bond remains unbroken. But then we need to consider what takes place in the following verses. That is, the next verse, God the Lord said, "Behold, man has become as one of us to know good and evil. And now, lest he send forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat of it and live forever. So, before we continue, what would be so terrible about Adam and Eve eating of the tree of life and living forever? What? Well, and to put it in more specific terms, we'll say, there wouldn't have been anything wrong with Adam and Eve eating of the tree of life and living forever if the sin hadn't taken place. But after eating of the tree of knowing good and evil, there is the dire danger that if they would live forever, they would live forever in an unredeemed state. Death intervenes to redeem us from the mess that we would otherwise bring upon our own souls. So God protects us from what would otherwise be the horrendous consequence of living forever, living unredeemed forever. And so, we read, again, God the Lord said, behold, man has become as one of us, to know good and evil, and now, lest he send forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat of it and live forever. And he banished mankind, and set up to the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim, cherubs, and the revolving sword to guard the way to the tree of life. Right? That's what we read? Yes? 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 No. No. I fooled you, and you didn't even notice. I just read verse 22, followed by verse 24, and I skipped verse 23. And you didn't even notice it was missing. Because the truth is, you're right, verse 24 conceptually follows on the heels of verse 22. Except that there's verse 23 in the middle. Verse 23 reads, and God the Lord sent forth the man from the Garden of Eden to work the earth from which he was taken. And I submit to you, if verse 23 wouldn't have been there, we'd be finished. Because if I just read verse 22, followed by verse 24, that God is saying that man needs to be kept from getting to the tree of knowledge for his own good, and in the Hebrew, vayegaresh et ha'adam, God banishes man, then we would be excused for thinking that it's all over. The relationship with God has been sundered, and it's finished. God banished us. And that's why before you get to the banishment, which does take place, I wasn't making up the verse, it's there. Before that, in verse 23 we read, and God sent him forth. Sent him forth, the Hebrew, is the word that we use for being sent on a mission. The bond isn't broken. The bond remains. When God sends Adam and Eve out of paradise, it is with a mission. You've got a job to do, to work the earth from which you were taken. Ultimately, it's going to be serving God just as it would have been if you had been worthy of staying in the Garden of Eden. It's going to be a different stage, a different arena, a different set of challenges, even a different human nature. Because, again, in the Garden of Eden, man had been a perceptive being, not a creative being, and now he's going to be a creative being. And now the summons of man is to function as a creative being in this world, not in the Garden of Eden, and to dedicate himself to God, to actualizing the mission that God gave him, that God continues to give each and every one of us. But the relationship isn't broken. The terms have changed. The circumstances are different. But it's not damnation. It's still connectedness with God. That's critical. Yes,
Yeah.
Yuri?
From YouTube, why didn't the snake pass the buck back to God like Adam did to Eve and Eve did to the snake?
Again,
Why didn't the snake pass the buck back to God? Because Adam passed the buck, Eve passed the buck.
well, actually, if you note, the manner in which God addresses Adam is with a challenge. The manner in which God addresses Eve is with a challenge. The manner in which God addresses the snake is direct condemnation. He doesn't give him a chance to answer. And the truth is, you're right. I don't know if passing the buck back to God was possible, but what he could certainly have said was, listen, God, you gave him a command. Why should he listen to me and not to you? It's his fault, which is true. But from this, we learn a critical principle, which is when someone casts himself as a tempter to make others sin, that's the worst of the worst. We don't look for ways to exonerate him. We look for ways to condemn him, seriously. That is, in our tradition, if a person corrupts another person, it's worse than if he killed him. There's nothing worse. As we see this just to give you a scriptural reference. We see this enunciated in Deuteronomy, in chapter, second. Chapter 23, when we read back to back that with respect to the Ammonites and Moabites, in verse 4 and on, they shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, even in the 10th generation, they shall not enter into the assembly of the Lord forever. And there is reference here to their having hired Balaam and what he did. Ultimately, what that includes, the culmination of what they did, was corrupting Israel in the Shittim, the Peor abomination. Whereas in verse 8 of the same chapter we read, you shall not abhor an Edomite because he is your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian because you are strangers in his land. The third generation that is born to them may enter in the assembly of the Lord. Now the Egyptians were killing us. They threw our babies into the Nile. But you don't abhor the Egyptians. The Moabites and Ammonites, they didn't kill anyone. They just strove to corrupt us. They are abhorred forever. So again, for this we learn that the worst thing is when you corrupt another person. And so the snake doesn't get any chance to exonerate himself. The snake is indicted. But again, getting back to Adam and Eve, the snake is cursed, Adam and Eve are not cursed. The connection with God remains. And that's really the most critical take-home message. Again, recalling what it is that we're saying with respect to that implicit message in the spelling of Haman's name, of the tree. Did you eat of the tree regarding which I commanded you not to eat of it? And again, I'm going to reiterate, there are two sides of this coin. One is to discern in that modality that emerges in Amalek, in Haman, really the root of evil, because the root of evil goes back to that first sin. And yet simultaneously, something that we need to harness as a basis for returning to God. That to be able to confront the evil that is personified by Haman and represented by Amalek. To confront that evil outside and inside. and always see life as a challenge to return to God. Any further comments? Because this really completes our discussion of this subject. Oh boy. Yeah, you're right. But we have a principle, and I'm not going to say this principle is anything by any means flippant, but a little bit of light can dispel a great deal of darkness. And that more than anything else is really the summons of life, to be able to choose the light. Choose, because it's all about choices. All about choices. To choose to dispel the darkness. We can't make those folks' life choices for them. But we can our own, and by so doing, we can combat the darkness. Yes?
Hi. I'm curious. I know that in Jewish tradition, when there's a death, they take clothing and they rip it. Is that still tradition today? Because if I remember right, the first time I heard about it was in the Bible, in the Torah.
That is, we definitely not only observe that tradition today, but we see this as enunciated in the Bible. That is, just consider that when the two sons of Aaron die, there is a special message that is communicated to Aaron and his surviving sons in Leviticus chapter 9. In verse 6, Moses said to Aaron and to Eleazar and Itamar, his sons, his remaining sons, don't let your hair grow wild, and don't rend your clothing, lest you die. And that will cause a rebuke for all the assembly. The implication being, this was an exceptional prohibition given to them to show these signs of mourning, which are incumbent upon all other mourners. Because this was when they were engaging in their consecration for service to the temple, and as a result, they were not allowed to observe the rules of mourning that under normal circumstances would apply to them and to everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Yes?
How is Eve not a corrupter of Adam like the snake corrupted Eve? We're really on it.
I wonder who asked that question, but we won't that. Okay. But the objection is valid, but since Eve was, in effect, riding on the coattails of the snake, so she isn't considered the tempter. The snake is the tempter. She was also a victim of the temptation. So it's really the one who initializes the temptation who is considered to be of utmost culpability. So again, that doesn't exonerate Eve, but it doesn't expose her to the same harshness with which the snake is treated. Okay. Anyone else? So I'd like to take the time that we have available. I realize we're not going to be able to finish this before the next break, but I'd like to at least begin to address it now, and then we can continue as far as we're able to get now, and then continue afterward. I wanted to share with you something that I think is on so many levels apropos. This was actually an answer that I gave to a pastor friend of mine. It was some years back when we already could see the extent to which the forces of godlessness seem so powerful around us and how to deal with them. So I'll share with you the questions, and then we'll embark upon trying to answer them. Sometimes we feel so surrounded by forces of godlessness that it seems hopeless for us to try to change them. We know God can annul these forces in an instant. Still, these forces seem invincible against all our this worldly efforts. At times, it seems that the best we could do is just to batten the hatches and circle the wagons, withdrawing into ourselves to avoid being affected by the negative influences that constantly bombard us. What guidance can we glean from the Bible for our behavior at such times? And a continuation, second question, if you will, again, realizing that God alone can and one day will vanquish these forces of godlessness. What does he expect of us? Should we be training ourselves just to wait patiently for him to intervene? Do we find role models in the Bible whom we can strive to emulate in formulating the appropriate strategy for confronting these challenges? And how does this strategy play itself out in God's ultimate plan? And finally, does this relate to the reconciliation beginning to take place between Jews and Christians today? So with that as our starting point, I'd like to begin attempting to address these questions, first of all, by soliciting some role models. And my first role models, this actually is going to be, in the course of the Bible, an excursion moving backwards through time. So my first role model is the most recent, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in the original Hebrew names Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. When we read in Daniel chapter 3 of Nebuchadnezzar's decree that everyone needed to prostrate himself to the golden image that he had set up. So again, we read in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said unto them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you will not serve my gods, nor prostrate yourselves to the old golden image which I set up? Behold, you are destined that at what time you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, harp, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you will prostrate yourselves to the image I have made. But if you worship not, if you do not prostrate yourselves, you shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Now I'm going to quibble over translations here because verse 17 does not begin with if, but rather, behold, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us. He will deliver us from the burning fiery furnace and out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor prostrate ourselves to the golden image which you have set up. God can save us, and whether he will or not, we don't know. And it doesn't make any difference because we're not bowing down to that golden image. Doesn't matter what's going to happen. And, of course, we know what happens, that Nebuchadnezzar commanded certain mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. So, of course, it has a happy ending. But the happy ending was not a condition for what they did. We are not bowing down. Doesn't matter what's going to happen. I think it's a critical message to us. Let's go a little bit further back in history before we go further back. Jeremiah, chapter 20. And while there are many passages that we can cite in Jeremiah, I'm specifically citing this one because you get a sense of just how difficult, maybe even miserable, with the circumstances of Jeremiah's life. O Lord, you have enticed me and I was enticed. You have overcome me and have prevailed. I am become a laughing stock all the day. Everyone mocks me. For as often as I speak, I cry out. I cry violence and spoil, because the word of the Lord is made a reproach unto me and a derision all the day. And so I wanted to resign. And I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more of his name. But it was in my heart, as it were a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I weary myself to hold it in, but cannot. Can't stop. For I've heard the evil report of many, terror gathering around. Tell, and we will tell about him, even all my familiar friends, them that watch for my destruction. Peradventure, he will be enticed, and we will prevail against him, and we will take our revenge on him. But the Lord is with me as an awesome warrior. Therefore, my persecutors shall stumble, and they shall not prevail. They shall be greatly ashamed, because they have not prospered, even with an everlasting shame, which shall never be forgotten. But, O Lord of hosts, tests the righteous, sees the reins of the heart. Let me see your vengeance on them, for unto you have I revealed my quarrel. Sing unto the Lord, praise you the Lord, for he has delivered the soul of the needy from the hand of evildoers. What a plaintive statement. Again, we appreciate just how much it hurts to be completely cast out, the object of derision and mockery, exactly as Jeremiah describes himself. And this is a recurrent theme in Jeremiah in particular. And the way he expresses it is, I wanted to keep silent and I couldn't. And obviously that doesn't mean he's being forced. It means someplace deep down, I cannot be contained. I need to speak the truth, even if no one is willing to hear it. And on the theme that we already see enunciated in Jeremiah, which is, they're all against me, but I'm with God. I just want to stress an idea that is enunciated, well, it's enunciated at least two places, more, but we'll focus on these two. When you stand alone with God, you're not alone. In the second book of Kings, in chapter 6, there is the story of the forces of Aram surrounding the city in which Elisha is lodging with his attendant. And when the servant of the man of God was risen early and gone forth, behold, a host with horses and chariots was round about the city. And his servant said unto Elisha, Alas, my master, what are we going to do? And Elisha says, we got them outnumbered. Fear not, for they that are with us are more than they that are with them. He doesn't even pray to God for the salvation because he knows the salvation is coming. He just prays to God for this young man. Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray you open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. They had him outnumbered. Yes. And just to emphasize essentially the same point, in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 32, we read when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib was come and his face was to fight against Jerusalem. So he took counsel with his princes and mighty men. They did the construction works they needed to do, but ultimately the construction works weren't what was going to save Jerusalem. And he spoke encouragingly to the people. Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid nor dismayed for the king of Assyria, nor for all the multitude that is with him. For there is a greater with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles. And the people relied upon the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah. When you stand alone with God, you're always in the majority, and you're always on the winning side. So, of course, that inevitably is a critical point for us to bear in mind. And it also means that you do what's right, even if what's right isn't popular, and at times may not even be safe. Consider the story of Moses. In Exodus chapter 2, it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown up, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and he saw there was no man. He smote the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And I ask you, why did he look this way and that way? So, of course, you gave this simple answer, the usual answer. You wanted to see if there were any witnesses. But I'm going to propose a different answer. He sees this gross miscarriage of justice. And he looks around to see, so who is going to rise to the occasion and right this evil? And he sees there's no one there. Ding! It dawns on him, I'm the man. I'm the one who needs to right this evil. And so he gets up and he kills the Egyptian. And I just want to stress, before continuing in this narrative, that Moses, in doing so, has a very important role model to be emulating, even if unbeknownst to him, and that would be God. Just consider what we read in Isaiah chapter 59. It is when truth is lacking, and he that departs from evil is considered mad. The Lord saw it, and it displeased him that there was no justice. And he saw that there was no man, and was astonished that there was no intercessor. Therefore his own arm brought salvation unto him, and his righteousness, it sustained him. And he put on righteousness as a coat of mail and a helmet of salvation upon his head. And he put on garments of vengeance for clothing, and was clad with zeal as a cloak. Likewise, in Isaiah chapter 63, the prophet, as it were, sees God coming from doing battle with Edom, with Botzrah. Why is your apparel red and your garments like he that treads in the wine vat? I have trodden the winepress alone. Again, alone. And of the peoples there was no man with me. And I trod them in my anger and trampled them in my fury, and their lifeblood is dashed against my garments. And I have stained all my raiment, for the day of vengeance that was in my heart and my year of vengeance are come. And I looked, sounds almost exactly like Moses, and there was none to help. And I beheld in astonishment, and there was none to uphold. Therefore my own arm brought salvation unto me, and my fury it upheld me. So Moses, in short, is simply emulating God. But you appreciate that he got into major problems as a result. That is, the next day, when again he sticks out his neck, or sticks it in his nose, when with two Hebrews who are fighting, one says to him, do you think to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, surely the thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Okay, now let's picture the scene. Moses is a fugitive. He is running for his life. He has fled from Egypt, fled to Midian, sitting by a well. Hello, maybe it's time to take a low profile? You almost got yourself killed. Try to work yourself into the woodwork. No one will notice you. You know what's the first thing he does? He gets into a fight with all the shepherds. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs with water to water his father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and saved them. and watered their flock. He gets into a fight with all the shepherds. Is he crazy? Get into a fight with all the shepherds when you're a vagabond, you don't even have anyone who knows you? And the simple, inevitable answer is, he can't help himself. He sees injustice. He cannot keep silent. We have to make ourselves into people who, when we see injustice, cannot keep silent. I vividly remember, this is 30 years ago, when the Nobel Peace Prize Committee decided that a legitimate resume for receiving the Nobel Peace Prize was being an arch terrorist. There was one man who resigned from the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. His name is Carrie Christensen. And the night that the prize was awarded, I was fortunate to be at a reception in his honor that was being held in Jerusalem. And when all the speakers praised his courage in taking the stand, his response, I felt, was very humble, but very meaningful. He said, I wasn't being courageous, I just wanted to be able to look at myself in the mirror the next day. Okay, my comment on that is, absolutely, it's the courage to make yourself into the kind of person who, if you wouldn't do what was right, would not be able to look at yourself in the mirror the next day. Everyone else on the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, I'm sure, has a mirror at home and had no problem looking at themselves in the mirror. He was the only one who couldn't. That's precisely emulating the way of Moses. You know, ultimately, we'll say this is the fulfillment, even though the Torah had not yet been given, of you shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. So these are all templates in courage. But of course, this is just the beginning of the story. And after the break, we'll continue.
Give him a big hand. Okay, this is your last break, 15 minutes, and then we'll have the last lesson from 4 to 5. We'll see you right back. All right, for those of us that have the stamina to stick it all the way to the end, this is the last lesson. The final. Only for today, yeah, of course.
Right?
That's right. And do you have a website you'd like to tell everybody
yes.
about? Well,
Yes.
come on up,
Okay.
tell us about
Okay.
it. And we're so thankful for Rabbi Chaim Eisen.
Okay, yes. The website is zionbiblestudies.org, which is not yet adequately complete, but you can find some stuff on it, and over the course of time, I definitely hope you'll be finding more and more stuff on it. Again, Zion Bible Studies as one word.org. Those who are here are please invited to take the brochures that talk about the services that are offered by our ministry and the essay, The Context and Purpose of My Mission to Build Bridges by Tearing Down Walls Between Jews and Christians, and the contact information, especially for the programs that we have in Israel. So please take from those that are on the back table. We continue where we left off. That is, we already discussed the templates for answering the questions with which we began of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And moving backward, chronologically, Jeremiah. And moving backward yet, Moses. And I'd like to consider at this point one additional profile in responding to the question of how we confront a world that so often, so glaringly turns its back upon God. And my last template is Abraham. That is, again, moving chronologically backward. In particular, when in Genesis chapter 12, the Lord said unto Abraham, "Go you out of your land, from your kindred, from your father's house, unto the land that I will show you." So we read in verse 5, Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all the substance that they had gathered, and all the souls that they had made in Haran. And they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, into the land of Canaan they came. And the question, inevitably, is, how do you make a soul? How do you make a soul? So, in our tradition, what this verse intimates is that Abraham and Sarah were on a mission. They were telling people about God. And they came with all of the souls that they had made in the sense of bringing people to God. And when you teach someone, when you guide someone, then that person becomes, in some sense, your spiritual child. That is, just consider, in Genesis chapter 18, we do read that God says, "I have known him," with respect to Abraham, "to the end that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice." But that's not just biological children. After all, in the second book of Kings chapter 2, we read repeatedly of the sons of the prophets. And conversely, we also read, both in the case of Elisha, crying out to Elijah, his mentor, "My father, my father." And likewise, Joash, the king of Israel, calling to Elisha when Elisha is on his deathbed, "My father, my father." So there's a parental filial bond between teacher and student. But then understanding all of the souls that they had made as referring to that bond. Inevitably, we have a number of questions that present themselves. First question is, so what happened to all these people? That is, just consider, in Genesis chapter 14, verse 14, we read that when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318, and pursued as far as Dan. That's the only thing we read about anyone other than his own family. When Jacob goes down to Egypt in Genesis chapter 46, everyone who was with him is a direct descendant. We read this reckoning also in Exodus chapter 1. So what happened to all these folks whom Abraham and Sarah were bringing to serving God? That's the first question. Second question we could ask is, Abraham and Sarah were not the first righteous people. There was Noah. There was Noah's righteous son Shem. There was Aver. There were a number of righteous people before Abraham and Sarah. We don't read about them involved in this proselytization effort. And third question, which kind of flows from the second, is why exactly do we consider Abraham to be the first patriarch of Israel and Sarah to be the first matriarch of Israel? And I remember many years ago hearing an answer that answered all three of these questions. What happened to all of these people whom Abraham and Sarah were proselytizing? Sad to say, they all eventually backslid into idolatry and oblivion. None were left. And that's why by the time Jacob is going down to Egypt, it's all members of his own family. Why did the righteous people who preceded Abraham and Sarah not dedicate their efforts to this proselytization effort? Predictably, because they foresaw that it was useless, that it wasn't going to accomplish anything, because these folks were not going to remain faithful. What makes Abraham the first patriarch and Sarah the first matriarch of Israel? They weren't the first righteous people, but because they also appreciated that their efforts may not amount to anything, and that didn't stop them. It didn't stop them because you do what's right, because it's right, not for any other reason. So if you have an opportunity to proclaim God's word to people, you don't start making calculations, is it going to work? Are they going to listen? Are they going to change? You just do it, because you do what's right. What will come of it isn't up to you. They have free will. There are circumstances that are beyond our control. What's in our control is to do what's right because it's right. And that's the only consideration that we need to ask ourselves. Is it right? And this is something that we discern on a whole additional plane with respect to Abraham. A turn of phrase that is particularly significant when we contrast it with one of the great righteous people who preceded Abraham, Noah. In Genesis chapter 17, and when Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said to him, I am God Almighty. Go yourself before me and be wholehearted. Don't go with me. You go in front. And I will make my covenant between me and you and will multiply you exceedingly. And you will be the father of a multitude of nations. And being a father of a multitude of nations doesn't mean biologically you're going to be fathering all these nations. You will be guiding all these nations. Father in Hebrew could also mean principal, chief. You'll be proclaiming this word. To Abraham, God says, you go before me. In contrast, perhaps ironically, the way Noah is described is Noah went himself with God. He went with God. He didn't go in front. When God told him what to do, he did. He didn't do anything more than what God told him to do. So perhaps most glaringly, there are folks, we know them all, there are folks who like to have their names on the marquee, right? A big banner saying, look what's mine. Okay, so where did Noah get his name on the marquee? Not the greatest place. In Isaiah chapter 54, for this is as the waters of Noah unto me, as I've sworn that the waters of Noah should no more pass over the earth. The flood is called the waters of Noah. So Noah got his name on the flood. Wow, that's great, isn't it? Not exactly. And why did he get his name on the flood? Because he didn't do anything to stop it. Because when God said, I'm going to bring up a flood to eradicate all of wicked humanity, all that Noah said was, whatever you say, boss, build the boat. Coming right up. Did he do anything to try to reform his contemporaries? Nothing. Did he do anything to try to pray to God to repeal the decree of the flood? Also nothing. He just followed orders. Now mind you, following orders is a very bad excuse if it's not God whose orders you're following. Following God's orders isn't bad. He is, after all, called a man righteous and wholehearted, but it's just following orders. And when the flood comes, we name it for Noah. And what about Abraham? We talk about standing up for what is right. Abraham exemplifies standing up for what is right, even standing up to God. When God says, I'm destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, the 5 cities, Abraham gets into a fight with God. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous and the wicked? Peradventure, there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you sweep away and not forgive the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? God forbid you do that! That be far from you to do like this manner, to slay the righteous and the wicked. The righteous will be as the wicked. That be far from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do justly? What an accusation. And I always note, parenthetically here, for those who might think that the only way that we define justice is by emulating God, Abraham gives the lie to that definition. If Abraham would have accepted that definition, then he wouldn't have a case. Whatever God does, that's justice. Abraham says to God, I have an internal gauge of justice. Now, of course, it's there because God put it there, but it's there. And I'm holding you to it. Shall not the judge of all the earth do justly? And rather than indict Abraham for getting into this fight with God, we regard that as Abraham's lasting legacy. That Abraham is the one who instructs his children and his household after him to do righteousness and justice, not compromise, to stand up to everyone. And this principle of standing up and doing what is right and not merely going with the flow is something that in our tradition is embedded in the last word of the story of creation. The last word of the story of creation is, of course, Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. But if we're going to translate that verse rigorously, literally, God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because in it he ceased from all his work which God created to do. That's what it says. God created to do. What does that mean? Created and did, or just created? Who needs to do? And we have an answer in our tradition that this formulation signifies there's still more work that needs to be done. So the Midrash says, where is the work complete? When we read, all the work was complete. In the first book of Kings, chapter 7, that begins with the words, Vatishlam kol hamelacha, all the work is complete. Which, of course, we could, on a facile, simplistic plane, read as, okay, they built the temple, that's what it's talking about. Now we can all go home. But of course, we appreciate the temple represents something. You're never finished. This world is an opportunity and a challenge. Strive constantly to fix it up. God gave you, again, as we discussed earlier today, an unfinished work. And it's very good precisely because it's not finished. Because it's a summons to us to do our utmost to finish it. And that's a message that we learn from all the righteous people whom we have cited. We already discussed the implications of God's blessing to Joshua, the high priest, at the time of Zechariah. I shall give you walkers among these standing ones. Man is the walker. Always going, always growing, always moving. The angels, their legs were straight legs. They turned not when they went. Man, as we already discussed, is born to labor. The flying beings fly upward. Man has to get to work. And this has a lot to do with the symbolism of light. In the Torah portion of this past Sabbath, we indeed read about kindling the light. You shall command the children of Israel that they bring unto you pure olive oil beaten for the light, to cause a lamp to burn continually. And this is not only the physical lamp, it's the spiritual light. We read in Isaiah chapter 42, verse 6, I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness, and have taken hold of your hand, and kept you, and set you for a covenant of the people, for a light of the nations, to open the blind eyes, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, and them that sit in darkness out of the prison house. And likewise, in Isaiah chapter 49, which is addressed to Israel, in whom I am glorified, I will give you for a light of the nations, that my salvation may be unto the end of the earth. And so that light means, as we read it in Isaiah chapter 60, verse 1, arise, shine, for your light is come, and the glory of the Lord is shone upon you. And ironically, I think this is so supremely relevant today. We have so many passages in the Bible talking about darkness. Darkness precisely when the day of the Lord comes. Isaiah chapter 13. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel and full of wrath and fierce anger. The stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. And all this is the day of the Lord's fierce anger. In Joel chapter 2, the day of the Lord comes. It is near, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, as blackness spread upon the mountains. The sun and the moon are become dark. The stars withdraw their brightness. And this is a recurrent theme. I don't want to over-belabor it, but Joel chapter 3, the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord come. In Joel chapter 4, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon darken. The stars withdraw their brightness. Zephaniah chapter 1, the great day of the Lord is near. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of ruin and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Amos, chapter 5. Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord. It is darkness and not light. Shall not the day of the Lord be darkness and not light? Even very gloomy and no brightness in it? In Amos chapter 8. It shall come to pass in that day, says the Lord God, that I will cause the sun to go down at noon, and I will darken the land in the clear day. All about the darkness coming, and yet there's a positive aspect to this. Chapter 8, verse 11. Behold, the days come, says the Lord God, that I will send a famine in the land. Not a famine for bread, nor a thirst for water, but to hear the words of the Lord. And that theme, then, ultimately is the restoration. That as you have this darkness, it leads us somewhere. In Isaiah chapter 11, there shall go forth a shoot out of the stock of Jesse, and a twig shall grow forth out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And ultimately, where does this lead? Verse 5, and righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins. Verse 9, they shall not hurt, nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the seabed. And that inevitably is what we sense, what we appreciate in the coming of all this darkness as a prelude to the great light of that coming of the day of the Lord and God's salvation. And we need to build toward it. In Malachi chapter 3, on the one hand, it's, behold, the day comes, it burns as a furnace. But unto you that fear my name shall the sun of righteousness shine, with healing in its wings. And you will go forth and gambol as calves of the stall. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. And he shall return the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their father. And it's in that vein, or perhaps I should better say in that light, that we appreciate the message of Isaiah chapter 60. We saw all about the darkness, but arise, shine, for your light is come, the glory of the Lord is shone upon you. Behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness the peoples. But upon you the Lord will shine, and his glory will be seen upon you. And nations will walk at your light, and kings at the brightness of your shining. The sun will be no more your light by day, neither for brightness shall the moon give light unto you. But the Lord shall be unto you an everlasting life, an everlasting light, and your God, your glory. And so it is. We saw Joel chapter 3. We saw about all the darkness. But ultimately, in verse 5, it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call in the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be those that escape, as the Lord has said, and upon the remnant whom the Lord shall call. And of course, we speak of Mount Zion, Jerusalem. That's precisely what we already saw. We discussed this yesterday. Zion, Jerusalem. Many peoples will go and say, go you and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the Torah, teaching, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge between the nations, and shall reprove many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they live in war anymore. What exalted words that describe a future that, on the one hand, seems so distant, so remote, and simultaneously can be just around the corner if we get our act together. You know, I always like to note that the words of verse 4 are very well known. On the East Coast, there's an island called Manhattan, upon which is a big building called the United Nations, next to which is a big wall called the Isaiah Wall, on which the words of verse 4, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Those words are inscribed in a whole bunch of languages. Do I have to tell you they failed? They just failed. They failed spectacularly. You know why they failed? I'll tell you why they failed. Because they began the quotation one verse too late. It's wonderful to speak about they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. How are you going to get there? As long as I want to get over here and you want to get over here, either I knock you out of my way or you knock me out of your way, and there will never be peace. The most there can be is a ceasefire, and even that will be shaky. The only way there can be peace, when everyone realizes there's only one goal. There can be different, distinct missions within that goal as means to advancing that goal. Our loving Father does not give us a one-size-fits-all, take it or leave it. The only thing that's one-size-fits-all is a straitjacket. God prescribes to all of his beloved children the right route for them to come to him. We're coming from different places, so we're not going to take the same route. So, I believe God has given you your pathway to him through Christianity, through the gospel. God gave Israel our path to him through the Torah, through the Hebrew Bible. It's not the same path, but it's all subordinate to the same goal. There's only one goal, and that's precisely what we read in verse 3. They should have started the quote one verse earlier. That when many peoples shall go and say, go in, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us of his ways and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth Torah, the word of God from Jerusalem. That's one goal for all of humanity. Many missions, one goal. Then peace becomes not only possible, peace becomes inevitable. It all needs to be subordinated to that vision. And this is a challenge. You know, I always feel compelled to share this, especially since World War II and the Holocaust. Jews and Christians have increasingly come together, but it's ironic because they come together in the same room, trying their best to sidestep the great big elephant in the room, our religious identities. So, since religious identity has been such a fraught subject in the past, we kind of try to avoid it, and that's sad. Because if I come into a room and I leave my religious identity outside, I'm still outside. And I know that if you come into the room and you leave your religious identity outside, you're still outside. So who's in the room? it's a challenge because there's been so much sorrow and bloodshed, tears and blood shed over the course of the last 2 millennia. But we need to find the way to move forward. We need to find the way to move forward that enables us to understand this truth that a loving Father gave us different roots. So, of course, we realize we are civil, so we're not going to be at one another's throats. We also can't be at one another's souls. The basis of our standing together is mutual love and respect. I know I feel that keenly with my brother, Pastor Mark. That is, from my perspective, as a Jew, I'm going to tell you that I believe Christian believers are faithfully keeping God's covenant with Noah and all of humanity, and thus attain personal salvation and have a share in everlasting life and contribute to the final redemption of the world. I know you see your salvation in different terms. I'm not telling you why you believe you're saved, nor do you need me to tell you why you believe you're saved. I'm going to tell you why I believe you're saved, and why I therefore have no agenda to try to make you into something else. This is a challenge I appreciate. And I know many of my Christian brothers and sisters are still grappling with this challenge. I appreciate that my Christian brothers and sisters who would have me adopt Christian beliefs may nowadays be motivated by genuine love. But it's a love without respect. It is, treating Jews as a bunch of godless pagans that need to be introduced to God. Yeah, not going to hack it. First of all, it's a very difficult task, impossible, to read the Bible without realizing that God sent Israel to introduce him to the world. Jews know about God. And second, more directly, we can only stand together through both love and respect. And I pray that we do, because I believe the world needs to hear that message of Jews and Christians standing together, shoulder to shoulder, or as my brother Pastor Mark expresses it, one shoulder, conjoined twins, broadcasting a message that the world so desperately needs to hear today. That is, again, getting back to the starting point of this exercise, all that godlessness out there, we dare not keep silent. The world is hungry, thirsty. Remember the words of Amos chapter 8, verse 11. The days are coming when I will send a famine in the land, not a hunger for bread, nor a thirst for water, but to hear the word of God. Boy, is the world hungering and thirsting today. And we need to give them a message of hope, a message of light. As we discussed earlier, it just takes a little bit of light to dispel a great, great deal of darkness. And I just wanted to share with you, as a final conclusion in this exercise, a message that, to me, maybe this is a midrash of sorts, but I think it cries out to be noted from the words of Jeremiah. But in order to appreciate these words, I first need to share with you a little Hebrew lesson. The Hebrew word notzerim is a biblical word. In the Bible, notzerim, deriving from the root natsar, watching, means watchman. But in post-biblical Hebrew, notzerim takes on an additional layer of meaning, Notzarim are those who follow Yeshua Notzari, Jesus of Nazareth. So Christians are called Notzarim. It's exactly the same spelling. Two meanings, one word. So of course we appreciate that in Jeremiah, the plain meaning of the text, Notzarim means watchman. But I want to share with you two prophecies in Jeremiah, both concerning Notzarim. In Jeremiah chapter 4, for hark, when it declares from Dan and announces calamity from the hills of Ephraim. Make you mention to the nations. Behold, announce concerning Jerusalem. Notzarim come from a far land and give out their voice against the cities of Judah. As keepers of a field are they against her round about, because she has been rebellious against me, says the Lord. Notzarim, watchers. Perhaps Notzarim, the followers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. They are come to Jerusalem to destroy her. And while that is, of course, what the text means, the biblical meaning, we'll add on another layer. Historically, we've known Notzarim, who have likewise, in the post-biblical sense of the term, come to Jerusalem to destroy. When the first crusade entered Jerusalem, on the 15th of July, 1099, the Crusaders massacred every man, woman, and child in the city. But that's only one prophecy. Jeremiah chapter 31. It's also about Notzarim, but a very different kind of Notzarim. From afar the Lord appeared unto me. Yea, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, with kindness have I drawn you. Again will I build you, and you will be built, O Virgin of Israel. Again shall you be adorned with your tabrets, and shall go forth in the dances of them that make merry. Again shall you plant vineyards upon the mountains of Samaria. The planters shall plant and shall redeem them. For there shall be a day that the Notzarim shall call upon the Mount Ephraim, arise, and let us go up to Zion unto the Lord our God. So again, the biblical meaning of Notzarim is watchers. We see Notzarim in the post-biblical sense today, saying, let us go up to Zion unto God our Lord. What a blessing to see this new day dawning, this new light shining. And I pray that we all be part of this dawn that is breaking and this light that is shining in the world, as Jews and Christians together can declare, let us go up unto Zion, unto the Lord our God. And of course, inevitably, this brings me to a verse that I've already shared with you, and I always like to cite. Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9, for then will I turn to the peoples a pure language, that they may all call in the name of the Lord, to serve him shoulder to shoulder, or again, as Pastor Mark will tell us, one shoulder, conjoined twins. To keenly feel that fellowship. To ready ourselves, and thereby to help ready the world for establishing God's kingdom. No, we're not going to be able to do it on our own. That's absolutely true. But remember, what's the greatest gift that God gives us? You are my junior partners. I'm giving you a summons. It's an opportunity. But when God gives an opportunity, automatically it morphs into a responsibility. we do this together. Fellowship, partnership. Beyond the fellowship and partnership of Jews and Christians, and all together, junior partners of God, in bringing the world to that exalted day of the Lord, when God's kingdom will be established for all to see, and the whole world will be filled with knowledge of God as waters cover the seabed. Amen. God bless you. Any additional questions? Anyone here, please? Sorry? I'm sorry. What? She didn't have a tribe. That is, she has children. There are interesting questions with respect to who her children might be. There's even the possibility that perhaps Joseph's wife, Asenat, might be Dinah's daughter. But that's a question for another story. I think we'll. Well, my first and principal blessing. You just yes for blessing, yeah. My first and principal blessing is what I already said earlier today. Lech, le, shalom, and you all remember what that means. Not go in peace, go toward peace. Constantly going, constantly growing, that we should all be recipients of that blessing that God bid Zechariah convey to Joshua, the high priest, in his time. I will give you walkers among these standing ones. And with that, the Aaronic blessing, may God bless you and keep you. May God shine his countenance upon you and grace you. May God raise up his countenance to you and give you shalom, completeness, true peace. Amen.
Amen. All right, let's give him a big hand again. Yay! We appreciate Chaim. May you all be blessed. Go get any of his material if you haven't got it yet. Don't forget to go to his website.
Yeah. And come back again because it's still a work in progress.